London 1327. A baker named John de Stratford is tied to a wooden hurdle, basically a crude sled, and dragged through the filthy streets of the city, while his neighbours throw rotting vegetables, animal waste, and whatever else they can find at his head. His crime? His loaves were 2 ounces underweight. 2 ounces. Welcome to medieval England, where baking bread was one of the most essential, most regulated, and most publicly humiliating professions you could choose. And yes, I said choose because somehow people kept becoming bakers, despite knowing that one bad day could end with them strapped to a wooden frame in the town square while children pelted them with cabbage. Medieval bakers weren't just tradesmen. They were basically operating under Yelp review conditions, except instead of 1 star, you got dragged behind a horse. The regulations governing their trade were so strict, the punishments so severe, and the public scrutiny so intense that bakers developed an entire survival strategy that we still use today: the baker's dozen. So why were medieval towns so obsessed with regulating bread? How did a loaf being slightly too small become a crime worthy of public humiliation? What exactly happened when you broke these laws, and how did bakers navigate a system designed to catch them failing? Let's step into a medieval bakehouse. The year is 1266. The assize of bread has just been enacted. You've spent years learning your trade, you've finally opened your own shop, and you're about to discover that baking bread in medieval England is less about feeding people and more about not getting dragged through sewage while the town watches. Welcome to the job where the customers could literally have you arrested, and they did it regularly. In 1269, England enacted the assize of bread and ale. And if you think modern regulations are annoying, buckle up. This wasn't a simple make good bread law. This was a mathematical nightmare designed to ensure bakers couldn't make a profit without risking public humiliation. Here's how it worked. The price of bread was fixed based on the current price of wheat. When wheat cost more, bakers could charge more. When wheat cost less, the price dropped. Sounds reasonable, right? Except the weight of the loaf had to adjust accordingly. If wheat prices rose but bread prices stayed fixed, your loaf had to be smaller. If wheat was cheap, your loaf had to be bigger. The bakers didn't set these prices. The government did. Local officials called ale tasters. Yes, that was their actual job title. And yes, they also regulated bread because medieval bureaucracy was apparently run by people who enjoyed irony, would check the current wheat price and calculate what your loaf should weigh. And these calculations were absurdly specific. A farthing loaf of white bread had to weigh a certain amount. A halfpenny loaf of wheat bread, a different amount. Wastrel bread, the cheap brown stuff for poor people, had its own weight, requirements. There were different regulations for white bread, wheaten bread, and household bread, each with different weight-to-price ratios that changed every time wheat prices fluctuated. Imagine running a business where your profit margin is determined by government officials using medieval math, and getting it wrong by a fraction of an ounce means criminal prosecution. That was baking. But wait, it gets better. The assize also regulated your profit margin. You were allowed to make a profit, the law wasn't completely insane, but that profit was capped. For every quarter of wheat you bought, you could make a specific amount of money, not more. The formula was written into law. So medieval bakers were essentially price-controlled, weight-monitored, profit-capped small business owners living under constant threat of inspection. And the inspections were frequent, random, and conducted by local officials who were often looking for someone to make an example of. The medieval government had basically invented a system where bakers were guilty until proven innocent, and the proof required perfect mathematical precision, with tools that could barely measure accurately. You've probably heard of a baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12. It's charming, right? A little extra, a bonus, proof that bakers are generous souls who want to delight their customers. Nope. It's a survival strategy born from pure terror. Medieval bakers started giving 13 loaves when 12 were ordered because the penalties for short waiting were so severe that it was safer to give away free bread than risk the consequences. Think about that. It was economically preferable to lose money on every bulk transaction than to accidentally sell an underweight loaf. The penalties weren't just fines, though those existed and were substantial. You could lose money, lose your business license, or lose your dignity, and medieval people were remarkably creative about the dignity losing part, so bakers built in a buffer. Order 12 loaves, Here's 13, because if one of them is slightly underweight, the extra loaf covers it. Order 100, here's 108, because I am not getting dragged through the streets over someone's mathematical accusations. This practice became so standard that it was eventually written into guild regulations. The Worshipful Company of Bakers, yes, that's their real name, made the baker's dozen an official policy. What started as a desperate attempt to avoid punishment became institutionalised business practice. And here's the clever bit, it actually worked as marketing. Customers knew that buying from a baker meant getting a little extra. It built trust in a system designed to make everyone suspicious. Bakers couldn't advertise or compete on price, those were fixed, so they competed on reliability and generosity. The baker's dozen is basically medieval anxiety made into a sales pitch. I'm so afraid of being publicly humiliated that I'll give you free bread. Became, look how much I value your business. It's the same strategy, just rebranded. Some historians argue the practice predates the assize regulations and has different origins, but the timing is suspicious. The assize creates brutal penalties and suddenly bakers start giving away free bread? That's not coincidence. That's survival instinct. So next time you get 13 donuts, remember, you're benefiting from centuries of bakers being absolutely terrified of their customers and the government. Enjoy your anxiety bagel. Let's say you're a medieval baker and you've made a mistake. Maybe you miscalculated the dough. Maybe your apprentice was careless. Maybe the humidity affected rising time and your loaves came out smaller than usual. Maybe you were trying to eke out a tiny bit of extra profit because wheat prices had gone up and you're barely breaking even. Doesn't matter. You're cool. Here's what happened next, and buckle up because medieval justice was a spectator sport. First, there was the investigation. Local officials, often ale tasters, market inspectors, or guild representatives, would test your bread. They had official weights and balances, though the accuracy of medieval scales was questionable at best. If your loaf was under the required weight by any detectable amount, you were in violation of the assize. The penalties were tiered based on how bad the offence was and whether you'd been caught before. First offence, usually a fine. Hefty but manageable if you had savings. Second offence, bigger fine, possibly temporary loss of your right to bake commercially. Third offence, now we get medieval. Repeat offenders or particularly egregious cases, like bread that was significantly underweight or made with inferior ingredients to increase profit, faced physical punishment designed for maximum public humiliation. And medieval towns took their public humiliation seriously because it served multiple purposes: punishment for the offender, entertainment for the public, and a warning to other bakers. The most common punishment was the pillory. You'd be locked into a wooden frame in the town square, head and hands immobilised, for a set period of time, usually hours. The offending bread would be hung around your neck or burned in front of you. And then the public got involved. Medieval crowds did not hold back. Rotten vegetables were the polite option. People threw animal waste, dead cats, human waste, mud mixed with God knows what, and occasionally rocks if they were feeling particularly aggrieved about their underweight bread. You couldn't dodge, you couldn't protect yourself. You just stood there and took it, while your neighbours, people you'd see every day after this, expressed their opinions about your baking skills. The pillory wasn't just punishment, it was social destruction. Your reputation, your business, your standing in the community, all of it was being pelted with garbage along with your face. Quick question, would you have survived as a medieval baker? Let me know in the comments what profession you'd choose if you were transported back to the Middle Ages. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into historical food workers, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We're covering what ancient Roman bakers ate, and trust me, it's wild. Now back to the punishments, because the pillory wasn't even the worst one. If the pillory was bad, the hurdle was worse. Much worse. A hurdle was a wooden sled or frame, sometimes just a crude lattice of branches. For serious offences, repeated violations, deliberately cheating customers, or bread that was so bad it made people sick, you'd be tied to this thing and dragged through the streets behind a horse or ox. Let that image sink in for a moment. You're strapped to a wooden frame, lying on your back or stomach, being pulled across cobblestones, through mud, through the open sewers that ran down medieval streets, while the entire town comes out to watch and participate. The records are very specific about these punishments. In 1327, John de Stratford was dragged on a hurdle through the streets of London for selling underweight bread. In 1381, a baker named John Brid was subjected to the same punishment. The civic records describe these events in detail. The route taken, the duration, sometimes even noting the weather conditions, which suggests this was important enough to document thoroughly. The route mattered. These processions weren't quick trips around the block. They went through the busiest parts of town, the market square, past other bakers' shops, through residential areas, ensuring maximum visibility. The point was that everyone needed to see what happened to cheaters, and the crowd participated enthusiastically. Same as the pillory, but worse because you're moving, so more people get a chance. You're being pelted with garbage, while also being literally dragged through more garbage. The medieval streets were not clean. There's no pavement, no drainage system, just mud mixed with animal waste, rotting food, and human excrement from chamber pots emptied out windows. You're breathing this. It's in your mouth, your nose, your eyes. You're being physically injured by the dragging itself. Rope burns, bruises, cuts from the rough wood and stones. And you're being socially annihilated. Every person you do business with is watching this. Your family is watching this. Your competitors are definitely watching this, probably taking notes. After the dragging, you might also get pillory time, just to really drive the point home. Essentially, medieval bakers operated under Yelp review conditions, except instead of 1 star, you got dragged behind a horse. The customer is always right, and if they're not, you're still getting dragged. Not all baker punishments were about weight. Sometimes they were about quality, and this is where things get genuinely serious rather than just absurdly harsh. Medieval bakers sometimes added things to bread they shouldn't have. Not necessarily out of malice, though that happened too, but often out of desperation. When wheat was scarce or expensive, bakers would stretch their flour with additives. Some were relatively harmless. Ground peas, beans, or cheaper grains like rye or barley mixed into wheat bread. These made the bread less appealing and less nutritious, but they wouldn't kill you. Others were more problematic. Some bakers added chalk or ground limestone to make the dough whiter. White bread was expensive and high status, so passing off cheap bread as expensive bread meant better profits. Some added sawdust for bulk. In times of real desperation, there are records of bakers adding ground-up acorns, tree bark, or even dirt. And then there were the bakers who sold bread that had gone mouldy or was made from spoiled grain. This could actually kill people. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye could cause hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Mouldy bread could make entire families violently ill. When bakers were caught selling genuinely dangerous bread, the punishments were severe and sometimes creative in their cruelty. One baker in 14th century London was forced to eat his own spoiled bread in the pillory before being pelted by the crowd. The logic was clear. If it's good enough to sell, it's good enough for you to eat. There are records of bakers being banned from the profession entirely, a devastating sentence when you'd spent years as an apprentice, learning the only trade you knew. Some were branded, literally marked as fraudsters, so everyone would know what they'd done. The brand was usually on the hand or forehead, permanent and public. The medieval authorities didn't mess around with food safety because they understood something important. When bread is your primary food source and you're already living on the edge of malnutrition, bad bread can devastate a community. One baker's greed or desperation could sicken dozens of families. So while the punishments for short waiting seem absurdly harsh to modern eyes, the punishments for actual food safety violations were at least somewhat proportional to the harm caused. Medieval justice was brutal, but it wasn't entirely random. Here's where medieval baking gets really interesting. The bakers policed themselves. Well, sort of. It was complicated, like everything else in medieval bureaucracy. Bakers' guilds were powerful organisations that controlled who could bake commercially, where they could set up shop, how they learned the trade, and what standards they had to meet. In London, the Worshipful Company of Bakers received its first royal charter in 1155, making it one of the oldest guilds in England. These weren't social clubs, they were regulatory bodies with real legal authority. To become a master baker, you had to complete an apprenticeship, usually 7 years, under an established baker. Then you had to prove your skill by baking a masterpiece loaf that met guild standards. Then you had to pay fees to join the guild. Only then could you open your own bakehouse. The guilds had their own inspectors who would check bakeries regularly. This was partly about maintaining quality standards. Bad bakers made all bakers look bad, and partly about controlling competition. The guilds were essentially medieval cartels, protecting their members' interests while also ensuring nobody got too creative with the rules. But here's the tension. The guilds answered to local authorities who enforced the assize. So bakers were caught between their own guild regulations and government price controls. The guilds tried to advocate for their members, petitioning for relief when wheat prices made compliance impossible, but they also had to enforce the laws or risk losing their authority. This created a weird dynamic where your fellow bakers were technically your brothers in the guild, but they were also watching you carefully because your failure reflected on everyone. If too many bakers in a town were caught cheating, the whole guild could lose privileges or face increased scrutiny. Some guilds developed their own additional rules that were actually stricter than the assize requirements, essentially over-complying to prove their trustworthiness. Better to regulate yourselves harshly than have outside authorities do it for you. The guild system meant medieval bakers lived in a surveillance state, created partly by their own professional organisation. It was protection and prison simultaneously, which pretty much sums up medieval guild life in general. So why were medieval governments and communities so absolutely obsessed with regulating bread? Why did this one food item receive more legal attention than almost any other trade good? Because bread wasn't just food, it was survival, social stability, and political legitimacy all baked into one loaf. For the average medieval person, bread provided 70–80% of their daily calories. Not a significant portion, the overwhelming majority. If you were a peasant, a labourer, or anyone who wasn't wealthy, you ate bread for breakfast, bread for lunch, bread for dinner, and if you were lucky, you had something to put on the bread. Meat, vegetables, cheese. These were occasional additions to the main event, which was always bread. This meant bread prices directly determined whether people could afford to eat. When bread got expensive or scarce, people starved. When people starved, they rioted, and medieval authorities were very aware that food riots could destabilise entire regions. The assize of bread was essentially a medieval price control system designed to prevent social unrest. By fixing bread prices relative to wheat costs, the government was trying to ensure that bread remained affordable, even when wheat was expensive. The bakers absorbed the risk. They had to make less profit or take a loss during bad years, but in theory the system prevented starvation and revolution. The harsh punishments for cheating bakers weren't just about fairness, they were about maintaining this delicate social contract. If bakers were allowed to cheat on weights, bread effectively became more expensive, which meant poor people couldn't afford enough food, which meant instability and violence. Medieval governments understood something important. People will tolerate a lot of oppression, injustice, and hardship. But if you mess with their food supply, they will burn your city down. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was triggered partly by taxes, but also partly by food prices and availability. So when a baker was dragged through the streets for short waiting loaves, it wasn't just about punishing one cheater. It was political theatre, demonstrating that the authorities were protecting the food supply, and therefore worthy of continued governance. Every loaf of bread was a tiny piece of social stability. Every underweight loaf was a potential crack in that stability. And the medieval government was willing to be absolutely brutal to prevent those cracks from spreading. Before we wrap up, I'm curious, what other medieval professions do you want to hear about? Blacksmiths, alewives? Drop your suggestions in the comments. And if this changed how you think about history, hit that subscribe button. Next time we're exploring what Viking Age bakers ate, and trust me, it's not what you'd expect. Now let's bring this home. The assize of bread remained in effect, in various forms, for over 600 years. It wasn't fully abolished until 1815, and even then, some regulations persisted into the early 20th century. For centuries, British bakers operated under a legal framework that treated them as potential criminals, requiring constant surveillance. And you know what? It kind of worked. Bread remained relatively affordable and available throughout most of medieval England, even during bad harvests. The system was brutal, but it achieved its goal of preventing bread shortages from causing complete social collapse. The bakers who worked under this system were skilled tradesmen, operating under impossible conditions. They had to be mathematicians, constantly calculating weights and prices. They had to be diplomats, keeping customers happy while barely breaking even. They had to be precise craftsmen, because a mistake wasn't just a business problem, it was a criminal offence. And through all of this, they still took pride in their work. Medieval bread wasn't just sustenance, it was craft. Different types of bread for different occasions and social classes. Decorated loaves for holy days. The perfect crust, the proper crumb, the right rise. These men were artists working under threat of being dragged through sewage. So tonight, when you slice your sourdough or toast your bread, without checking if it's the legally required weight, remember the medieval bakers who couldn't make that bread without risking public humiliation. When you complain about food prices, remember the bakers who were literally dragged through the streets for charging a penny too much. History is full of people who did impossible jobs under impossible conditions. And somehow, despite the threats, the regulations, and the very real possibility of being pelted with rotten cabbage, they still made bread worth eating. Thanks for watching. And maybe give your local baker a break. They're not getting dragged through anything today, but they're still up at 3 a.m. making your breakfast.